Okay. Yeah. I'll give myself a note so I don't forget to do that. So you want me to like kind of ask if people can hear me first? Yeah. Like. When it's time, do you want me to just go, or were you gonna do like a? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll just wait over here then.
Hi there, welcome. Is that any better for those online? Now we can hear. Great. Nice. Excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to just introduce Dr. Castro briefly again. He's an associate professor of philosophy and director of the Certificate in Ethics, Artificial Intelligence, and Big Data at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. His primary areas of study are information ethics, fair machine learning, and epistemology. His recently published book, Algorithms and Autonomy, co-authored with Adam Pham and Alan Rubel, examines how algorithms in criminal justice, education, housing, elections, and beyond affect autonomy, freedom, and democracy. He's currently working on a project that relates ideas from egalitarian political philosophy to debates over how to measure fairness in machine learning. His title today, title of his talk today is Egalitarian Machine Learning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Castro.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I think really quickly, I want to make sure the mic is working for people online. Is it working? Okay, cool. Sure. All right, cool. Well, thanks again for having me. And so I'm here to talk about egalitarian machine learning, or at least that's what I'm calling the project. This is work I'm doing with two friends, David O'Brien at Tulane and Ben Schwann at Case Western Reserve University. Before I jump into the main ideas of the project, I think a little bit of background would be helpful. So I'll be talking about measuring fairness, which is a topic in machine learning and other related fields. And that sort of starts with the context of thinking about prediction-based decision systems, systems that roughly make predictions about people that inform decisions about them. The decisions themselves may be automated or not. My running example for this introduction will be Compass, which is actually a prediction maker that feeds into decisions usually made by humans. And Compass itself isn't actually developed using machine learning, but many prediction-based decision systems are. Machine learning being the science of getting machines to learn from data. Computers learn from data. So prediction-based decision systems abound. They're used all over the place. And Compass, my running example, is a real technology used to predict the likelihood of recidivism among defendants in the criminal justice system in the United States. And systems like Compass, being my example in this case, these systems can be unfair in surprising and hard to detect ways. Here's the Compass example, and this was sort of discovered through the work some work at ProPublica. Compass is fair in at least one sense, in that it's it's equally predictive across racial groups in the following way. Low-risk defendants reoffend at roughly the same rate, regardless of race. Or defendants identified as low risk reoffend at the same low rates, regardless of race. So if COMPAS identifies somebody as low risk, the likelihood that they'll go on to commit a crime in the near future is about the same whether they're white or black. Similarly, those identified as high risk by COMPAS reoffend at roughly the same rates, regardless of race. So in one sense, it has a kind of predictive parity, a kind of equivalence. However, and somewhat paradoxically, at the same time, COMPAS has unequal error rates across racial groups, which make it seem unfair to many people. So even though it has this sort of predictive parity, it's the information it gives about the likelihood of someone committing a crime is the same, regardless of their race. It's going to make different kinds of errors about people that make it look unfair across racial groups. So in the ProPublica study, what they discovered is that even though it achieves this predictive parity, it has an unequal error rate in the following way. Black defendants are much more likely to be mistaken as high risk by COMPAS. And white defendants are much more likely to be misidentified, falsely identified as low risk. So even though it has a certain kind of accuracy in one way, a certain kind of parity in one way that makes it seem fair, it has a different kind of asymmetry in another way that makes it seem unfair, at least to many people. One thing I should say that will come up later, although it's not the focus of this talk, is that it's in fact true that because COMPAS is fair in one way, it is unfair in the other way, or to use maybe slightly less biased language, because it's unbiased in one way, because it achieves that predictive parity, for that reason, in combination with a couple of other facts, it must be unequal in this other way. So there's a tension between maybe two things that we might want it to do. Both have predictive parity among groups and equal error rates across groups. Again, that won't be the focus of the talk, but it's an important part of background, that we kind of can't have everything that we want here. So because of the COMPAS controversy, and in part because of the kind of interestingness of that little paradox I just described, there has been an explosion of interest in the question of when prediction-based decision systems are fair. How do we audit them for fairness? What does it mean for them to be fair? So far, we're at the stage where there are lots of proposals, like a kind of predictive parity, or a kind of error rate parity, or something else. We'll talk about some of these. But right now, there's just a bunch of proposals in the form of what I'm calling formal fairness measures. These are measures that are formal in the sense that they're usually cached in some kind of mathematically precise term, so that, for instance, you might be able to program a machine to check if some other machine is being fair. And we'll talk through a couple of these in detail. One important thing at this stage is that there are all these proposals. There's not a lot of convergence on which ones matter. Further, as I just described, it's not like we can accept all of the proposals. They are in tension with one another. So there is some choosing to be done. I won't be going through like the hard business of arguing from one over the other at this point in the talk, but this is like part of the important background, is that there are lots of proposals out there, not a ton of agreement, and you cannot have all the proposals that are out there together. The other little last bit of background I want to talk about is, when I say fair in this talk, what do I mean? And what I mean is just in some vague sense, we care about something egalitarian, where what I mean by vaguely egalitarian is that we want people to be treated equally. We want people to receive equal treatment in some sense or another. And my saying that what I mean by fairness is something vaguely egalitarian is not something that I'm necessarily bringing to the table, but many of these fairness measures are explicitly motivated by something like egalitarianism, but oftentimes exactly what's meant by egalitarianism isn't specified. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is how there are several different measures, I'll talk about two in detail, several different egalitarian ideals that are different, and how your different kind of understanding of egalitarianism will have kind of an impact on how you want to think about your fairness measure. Okay, so moving into the plan for the talk, the first thing I'm going to do is introduce what I'm calling a framework. And the scare quotes is just a sign of modesty. I don't take this to be earth-shattering or big news or a big deal. I think it's like sort of an intuitive thing that probably a lot of people might have in mind. I've never seen anyone point it out. It'll help us organize our thoughts a little bit, but it's not meant to be a big deal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the choiceworthiness of some fairness measures from the perspective of some egalitarian principles. And the real idea of this talk is just like, I don't have like a grand argument really. I'm just going to do a little bit of exploration. One way to think about it is if there are some folks here that know some things about fairness measures, they might not know that much about egalitarian political philosophy. And among people who know about egalitarian political philosophy, they might not know anything about fairness measures. And the idea is that there's these two subject matters that are kind of in the same space and they're not always communicating with each other. And I just kind of want to point out that it's worth thinking about what kind of egalitarian you are if you want to say that I like a fairness measure because I'm an egalitarian, and understanding that there are complicated connections between the thing that you might use to measure the thing you care about and the thing that you care about, and that there's different versions of egalitarianism out there. Again, mostly for reasons of time, there are longer versions of this talk and paper. I'm only going to go through two iterations of that. Okay, and at the very end, I am going to draw a couple general lessons. I think they're supported by the talk, but it's not like I have a grand argument. It's more like I want to kind of help philosophers and others. But I guess I usually take myself to be, when I'm doing this, addressing myself to philosophers, get to know a little bit about some of these controversies in fair machine learning, and also hopefully to communicate to people working in technology the idea that egalitarianism isn't just one thing, or that it's a vague thing. How you articulate it matters. Okay, so first this framework. Suppose you're trying to determine a fairness measure. Maybe some kind of predictive parity, some kind of error rate parity, or something else. What should you pay attention to? Well, insofar as you take yourself to be motivated by egalitarianism, you should be paying attention to two things. One is in the box of egalitarian principle or principles, you should probably articulate what you mean by egalitarianism. And I'll go through some different examples of what you might mean by egalitarianism to show that it's not just one thing. And then on top of that, you probably want to be sensitive to the context and the empirical details in at least two ways. I won't be going through this too much in this talk, that's not the focus, but these are things to be aware of. One is which egalitarian principle or idea you think is in force might be sensitive to the context. I said at the beginning that machine learning or prediction-based decision systems abound, and that means that they're used in anything from advertising to housing to criminal justice, as the example that I discussed, admissions. We'll talk through some examples of admissions. And you might think that in different contexts, different egalitarian ideas are in play, right? So they might help you figure out which principle to use, but also what's going on in that context might also give you other things to pay attention about. So the thing with Compass, and this will come back, one of the key things about Compass that causes it to be unfair, at least by many people's lights, is that in fact, the statistical system that Compass is sensitive to the fact that in the data that Compass is trained on, arrest rates are higher among the Black population relative to the white population. And that's what causes it to pick up on a pattern and be biased. And those sorts of details might be relevant to exactly how to implement your idea here, right? So at one level, you want to be sensitive to the egalitarian principle in play and be informed by the context and other empirical details. That might be all you need, but I think just to kind of complete the picture, if you're trying to figure out which egalitarian principles matter, you're probably going to want to reflect a little bit on what the bedrock ethical principles are, right? And how exactly which ethical principle, how those ethical principles combine to help determine a egalitarian principle for a context will itself be sensitive to empirical details at that lower level. Okay. Again, I take this to be like sort of common sense. Maybe people could disagree with this, but I don't take it to be earth-shattering, and I don't take it to be too controversial. I just want to highlight a couple quick things that this illuminates. Some of these are more directly relevant to the talk, and some of them are just more directly relevant to thinking about these issues. One thing is that as this picture illuminates, disagreements over a measure could have many sources. Like I said, that it's not like we have perfect convergence on this is the measure that we want to use in all cases or in a certain kind of case, right? And one thing that this highlights is that anywhere we have a box or an arrow, we could have a different kind of disagreement. We might disagree over a measure because we have different ways of interpreting the same egalitarian principle. We might have a disagreement over a measure because we actually have different egalitarian commitments. And we might have those different egalitarian commitments because we have different ethical principles that we think are kind of like bedrock or essential. This is sort of the same point, but focusing on a different aspect of it. that also means that there's a number of normative criteria for scores to be held to. So if I'm out there using a score and I'm doing it if I'm out there using a measure to measure machine learning, to measure fairness, and I'm making a mistake, the mistake could be at any one of these junctures. Maybe I'm confused about what's called for in the context. Maybe I'm confused about how to apply a particular principle. Maybe I'm confused about what the right principle is. Maybe that's because I'm deeply confused about what the bedrock ethical principle is. So there's like a lot of layers. There's a lot of levels at which I could be making a mistake if I'm out there using a measure. And one reason that I point this out is among a lot of the machine learning literature, at least the machine learning literature that I'm familiar with, there's oftentimes a focus on just kind of formal properties of the fairness measure, how they perform in certain ways, but not like a lot of deep discussion of how they connect with these ideas that I think you should be really sensitive to, obviously. Like, what do we mean by fairness? What kind of principle are we trying to get after? Why do we think it's the right one? I'm going to go through two more quick things. One thing that this also highlights, this framework, if it's right, is that showing that a measure is right or wrong for a context does little to show that it's generally the right way to measure fairness, right? If we think that the right fairness measure for a situation is sensitive to all these details, that means that like if I have shown that using this thing is fair or unfair in criminal justice in America in 2020, or criminal justice in Miami in 2020, right? That doesn't mean necessarily even that it's the right one to use somewhere else at another time or in a different context like hiring or admissions. And then finally, another thing that this might highlight is that we don't necessarily have to agree all the way down to work together and to agree on something, right? So for instance, there might be different paths to the same egalitarian principle from different bedrock ethical principles. You might be a utilitarian, I might be some kind of Kantian, but we might both agree that people deserve an equal shot in a certain kind of way, in a certain kind of circumstance, like in hiring or something, and that we might be able to come together at the level of an egalitarian principle and move forward. So we don't have to agree all the way down to agree on a measure. Okay. So now kind of jumping more into like the what I take to be like the core of the talk. What I'm going to do now is, and I'll do this twice, is take a egalitarian idea, take a fairness measure that it seems to kind of jibe with, explain some reasons for thinking that they kind of go together, for thinking that they might be useful heuristics for one another in some contexts, but also show that they don't go together all the time. And just to kind of show that measures and principles that might intuitively go together don't always go together. And that's going to be kind of part of a general lesson of we need to be kind of precise what we mean. And we also need to understand that picking out a measure in a particular context could be quite tricky, even if we already know what kind of egalitarian we want to be. Okay, so the first egalitarian ideal I'll start with, I take to be a pretty minimal one. And that's sort of in the title, formal equality of opportunity. We might think in certain contexts, at least, that we want positions and posts that confer superior advantages to be open to all applicants, that applicants should be assessed on their merits, and that the applicant deemed the most qualified according to appropriate criteria should be offered the position. That seems like a pretty intuitive idea in a lot of contexts. It might be kind of minimal in ways I can point out later. It might not be enough, but I think that this is like a pretty common sense idea of something we might owe people in certain situations. And if we have a machine or some kind of algorithmic system doing our admissions or our hiring for us, we might want that machine to be held to a kind of measurable mathematized standard that some call equal opportunity. And what equal opportunity amounts to is what here, and I'll explain this further, I have as true positive error rate balance across groups. What that means is that we want the true positive rate to be in parity across groups. One way of putting this is that we want qualified people to have an equal shot regardless of their race, based on the system that we're using. And that sounds like a way of getting formal equality of opportunity kind of up and running. Here's like a quick visual example of what that might amount to. So let's say that a true positive for compass is identifying someone who is low risk of committing crime in the near future as low risk. What equal opportunity would ask for in that case is that if you look all the way to the right here on the screen, well, I guess that's left on the screen. Yeah, depends on where you're looking at it from. So if you look at the big gray circle, that is all of the white defendants who are low risk, and the little blue circle would be all of the subset of those defendants who are identified as low risk by the system. What we would want in the case of equal opportunity is we want the blue circle in relation to the big gray circle to be the same for both groups. Does that make sense? Even if even if the absolute sizes are different. Okay, so that's just kind of a visual example of what we're looking for. And that should, I guess, like in some sense, that might be an intuitive way of saying, regardless of your race, your shot of being identified as the thing that you are should be the same. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. That might be something that kind of goes into the background into how you're thinking about this. In the instance of Compass, the way that it was assessed was against what actually ended up happening. And you might not think that's perfect for various reasons. You might think that there's like some path dependency. But in the example of Compass is issuing these predictions about whether people are going to go on to commit crimes or not. And then what happened is we just kind of follow up on those people and see how many of them actually committed crime, and if there was any kind of like trends among the kinds of errors that Compass made, for instance. Yeah. But the question, I mean, so I'm kind of isolating kind of probably a sort of one question among many. You know, you kind of have to kind of hit pause on some things and focus on others. The question of like how this compares to the next best thing would probably be important at some point. I'm just not something I'm focusing on. So Compass, for all of its problems, is oftentimes better than a human judge who would be more biased, right? And that's an important thing to consider. So I'm not necessarily saying that Compass or prediction-based decision-making should be thrown out, right? We just need to be careful about how we want to measure its fairness. Yeah, good. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is just talk about how even though these things might seem like they go together, you might think that like, oh, well, if I just care about formal equality of opportunity, then maybe like off the shelf, my kind of measure will be something like equal opportunity. And all I want to show is that things are more complicated than that. And then we'll move on to a different pairing. So the two questions I want to ask about each of our pairings is one, whether one is sufficient for the other, and then whether one's required for the other. So I'm going to ask, is achieving equal opportunity, the measure, enough to show that you've achieved formal equality of opportunity, the kind of egalitarian ideal or principle? In this case, graduate school will show that that's not true. It's not true that just satisfying the measure equal opportunity is enough for satisfying formal equality of opportunity. So the case that I'll use to demonstrate this is called graduate school. I'm just going to read the case. The admission system for a graduate program requires scores of a test that is only administered on a religious holiday for a minority group. Requiring the scores of that test will ensure that most members of the minority group will not be able to take the test and thus will be unable to apply. So if we imagine that at least some people in this minority group go and take the test, and if let's just stipulate to make things easy that the test is like sort of omniscient, it's just if you're qualified, you pass, and if you're not qualified, you don't pass. The error rate is 0. So so the error rate across groups is the same. And yet, even though among those who are scored, equal opportunity will be satisfied, formal equality of opportunity will not be satisfied because there are many people who had a barrier to applying. Namely, they don't have a test score, and they don't have a test score for reasons that just look like just a barrier to them taking the test that they shouldn't be held account for. Okay, I have to admit, I think that's like the least interesting case that I have so far. The other ones I hope are a little bit more interesting than that, but it shows what I needed to show, right? That these things just are not automatic proxies for each other. So the next case is designed to show, well, suppose we think, okay, well, maybe if you satisfy equal opportunity, you don't automatically satisfy formal equality of opportunity. But maybe you have to satisfy equal opportunity in order to show that you've satisfied very formal equality of opportunity. And this case, which is now a little bit more stylized and will require a little bit more explanation, will show that that's not true either. That it's not the case that you have to satisfy equal opportunity to satisfy formal equality of opportunity. The case is called job. And in job, you're hiring. Job applicants take a highly but not perfectly accurate aptitude test. Members of an oppressed minority group are much more likely to be qualified for the position. And this is because other employers discriminate against that group, leaving a high portion of qualified members of that group on the job market. As a result of the discrepancy in the base rates, where the members of the minority group are much more likely to be qualified, and the tests being highly but imperfectly accurate, true positives are more common among the minority group than in the majority group. So a couple things that I should say. This is basically Compass. This is basically like in a very simplified way what's going on with Compass. It just happens to, in this case, favor people in the minority group as opposed to being biased against them. And this, as well as Compass, the Compass outcome is compatible with a thing being blind to things like people's race. It can pick up on these patterns by looking at things that don't reveal people's race, because the kind of thumbprint of people's identities are all over their data. It's not, you don't have to just know about their, for instance, their protected attributes. And basically what's happening in this case is the system, the smart statistical system, is trying to figure out who's qualified, and it's picking up on a pattern, and it's homing in on the fact that there's a subgroup of people that are more likely to be qualified, and thus it's kind of making errors in the direction of assuming that they're qualified. The important thing for us is that in such a case, because it's just like Compass, equal opportunity is going to be violated. You're not going to have error rate parity. You're going to have higher false positives among the minority group. However, formal equality of opportunity mustn't see a problem with this. Anybody who wants to apply can apply. They are being assessed on their merits. The system is not perfect, but it's highly accurate. It's maybe the best proxy we have to get to the question. This might be the best proxy we have for assessing, for predicting people's qualifications. And the fact that it's making some errors and is maybe even biased in some direction isn't the sort of thing that formal equality of opportunity has to care about, right? So you can satisfy formal equality of opportunity while violating equal opportunity, which just kind of shows that these things are not perfect proxies for one another. Okay, what I want to move on to now is what I think of as like maybe some more robust standards and some more interesting maybe ideals. And to do that, I want to just really quickly motivate the idea that maybe there's reason to go look beyond formal equality of opportunity and equal opportunity. There we go. Okay, so I just kind of want to show that like maybe formal equality of opportunity doesn't get everything right and doesn't totally capture intuitions, and that we might want to look at other ideas. So consider graduate school 2, another case. The admission system for a graduate program requires scores of a difficult test, and members of minority groups on average do poorly on the test because they cannot afford the test preparation needed to be competitive. So in a situation like graduate school 2, which let me embellish a little bit more. Let's suppose that members of the minority group are also less qualified because they've had less access to the training needed to be competitive, right? In such a case, formal equality of opportunity sees no problem. Formal equality of opportunity does not say that people need to have equal chances to develop qualifications. It just means that people need to be able to submit applications and that they'll be assessed on their merits. So it doesn't mean that people need to have equal opportunities in the sense of like having equal opportunities to develop their talents. And so insofar as we think that systems like graduate school 2 evidence some kind of unfairness, we might say, well, we want something a little bit more robust than that. And in like a longer version of the talk, I introduced a standard called substantive equality of opportunity. We're going to skip over that one for now. But basically, substantive equality of opportunity says, let's achieve formal equality of opportunity, plus add the idea that people need to have equal chances of developing the qualification needed. So for instance, that people shouldn't be restricted to the training on the basis of not having enough money to pay for it or something like that. Okay, so insofar as like graduate school 2 grates on us, maybe it doesn't, maybe it does. It grates on me a little bit. So I might want something a little bit more robust than formal equality of opportunity. Now let's look at equal opportunity and our intuitions about being fair, that the fairness measure. I think like in the job case, I'm not deeply bothered by what's going on in the job case. It's a complicated case, but basically you have people who have been discriminated against having slightly more favorable outcomes when they face a certain kind of system, because it's trying to just detect who's qualified and doing its best job of that. That doesn't bother me too much. So I tend to think that there's more to fairness than what equal opportunity is looking at. Another way of seeing that intuition is if you agreed with my thoughts about graduate school too, if the people in the minority group don't have the qualification at the time of being tested because they haven't had equal opportunity to take the training, then equal opportunity will see no problem with that if the test is, let's say, perfectly accurate at detecting qualifications, right? So again, if graduate school 2 grates on you, then that's another strike against equal opportunity. So let's look at something a little bit more robust than both of these standards. Let's see. For some reason, the slide's not advancing. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to look at just one other pairing because it's all we have time for. I'm going to look at luck egalitarianism as an ideal and something called counterfactual fairness, which goes beyond looking at statistical criteria. Counterfactual fairness involves using causal models and thinking counterfactually, which things like equal opportunity do not. So it's a little bit more complicated. So let's start with luck egalitarianism, which is a fairly simple idea, I think, at least to describe. Luck egalitarianism says it's unfair for some to be worse off than others through no choice of their own. So looking back at graduate school too, you might think that that's one way of articulating the intuition there. Some people just don't get an equal chance at developing the qualification because they just don't have enough money. And luck egalitarian might have a way of explaining that. Well, it's just like not good for people to be worse off because they didn't have a chance. Okay. Counterfactual fairness, and we're gonna go through this a couple times because it's a little bit more complicated. And I should say, as with equal opportunity and counterfactual fairness, these are often expressed in kind of mathematical terms. I'm doing it in non-mathematical terms. So we're gonna kind of work through an example to just kind of show kind of what the algorithm for assessing counterfactual fairness looks like, but doing it without any math or mathematical notation. So the first kind of gloss I'll give of counterfactual fairness is that counterfactual fairness identifies as unfair systems whose predictions about an individual would change if that individual's protected attributes were otherwise. The basic intuition here is supposed to be, or the basic idea here is what counterfactual fairness wants to know is that if you take an applicant who, say, was admitted entry and then hold fixed certain attributes while shuffling things like their race and gender, and then reran them through the system, if it would deny them entry on the basis of that shuffling, if it would let them in but not a certain counterpart of theirs, then the system is identified as unfair. So that's what I have written here as like a first kind of intuitive example of counterfactual fairness. And before I move through a more detailed example, I should just say that I think that there's something like an intuitive connection between luck egalitarianism and counterfactual fairness. We don't choose things like our racial identification, and yet and so we don't want people to be worse off just because of, for instance, because of their race. And counterfactual fairness is one way of like detecting if a system is treating people differently or not letting people in just because they have different racial attributes, for instance. Okay. And I should also say that people who developed counterfactual fairness, that's what they kind of claim to be motivated by something like egalitarianism. And I don't say claim because I think that they're lying, but I say claim because that's like kind of what they say, but I think that things are a little bit more complicated than that, as I'll show shortly. But first we'll work through a more detailed example. So what I'm going to work through is an example of just thinking about a prediction-based decision system for entry to law school, a totally hypothetical case, to show how we would try to see if a system is counterfactually fair. We're going to work through the example. It's a little bit complicated. And then actually let us say something a lot more simple once we work through it. So there's going to be a way of summarizing what counterfactual fairness asks for that's way more simple than thinking through the details of an example like the one we're about to go through. So imagine that you're a law school, you have a bunch of undergraduate GPA data, you have a bunch of LSAT score data, and then you have a bunch of data about how people did in law school. And what you're going to do, you hire maybe a data scientist and you're saying, look, applicants give us their GPAs and their LSAT scores. Can you use that information to project how people will do in their first year? And if you can, with any accuracy, that'll help us hire people who will succeed in their first year, and maybe people who do well in their first year go on to get jobs. That'll make the school look good and get kind of a virtuous kind of feedback loop going. So what I want to do is consider a particular applicant. We're going to see what it means for this particular applicant's counterpart to be denied access even though they got entry, and then to show it like that's what counterfactual fairness is looking for. So imagine a particular applicant who gets run through the system. They have a undergraduate GPA of 3.5 and an LSAT score of 150. And our data science magic tells us that this person will get a 3.8 in their first year. And we say anyone above a 3.7, for instance, should gain entry. Okay, now if we want to know whether this system is counterfactually fair, what we need is a whole lot more information than we have right now. The first thing that we need is a causal model. What we need is a sense of what factors exert causal influence on the things that we're looking at. Now, this is a super oversimplified model of what's going on just for illustrative purposes. So let us pretend that what your undergraduate GPA, LSAT score, and first year law grades end up being are determined by your race, your sex, and this totally made up variable called your studiousness level, right? And the idea is that obviously studiousness, being highly studious would help increase all of these scores, and that your race and sex would play very complicated roles through things having to do with structural racism and sexism that kind of distort the signal that the studiousness sends to these other variables. And to determine whether this system is counterfactually fair, we first need to know the protected attributes of the applicant we were looking at. We're going to stipulate for the example that it was a white male with a studiousness level score of 7. And for this, and the studiousness level, again, is just totally made up. And for this example, we're going to kind of pretend that we have kind of God's eye view and that we know exactly how all of these things are interplaying, such that, for instance, we do know that the person has the studiousness score, we know their race and sex, and we also know exactly how those things kind of conspire to determine one's undergraduate GPA and whatnot. Of course, like we have to kind of suspend belief here a little bit because this is a very, very oversimplified example. Okay, so to determine whether the system is counterfactually fair, not only do we need to have this kind of causal graph, we then need to kind of show that either every counterpart of this person gets in, or at least one doesn't. If one doesn't, then the system's not counterfactually fair because they have a counterpart who gets denied access. So to do that, what we do now with kind of our God's level or God's eye point of view of the causal kind of situation, we scrub out the actual applicant's information and we replace it with other information while holding fixed only those things not causally affected by protected attributes, in our example, race and sex. So we're going to change the race to Black and the sex to female. And again, using kind of a fictional level of understanding of the causal situation, this will allow us to see that this person, that this counterpart of the initial applicant would get an undergraduate GPA that's lower, again, for reasons having to do with like racism and sexism, a lower LSAT score, and that they would get, therefore their projected first year law grade would be lower, and therefore they would be below that 3.7 threshold and they would be denied, they would not be extended admissions. So this system would be counterfactually unfair. Now that we've kind of worked through how that works, that's like kind of working through the algorithm of determining whether a system is counterfactually fair. I can say something a lot more simple and say that what counterfactual fairness amounts to on the ground is a prohibition on using for the purposes of predicting the thing that you're looking for and ultimately your decision, anything that's causally downstream of protected attributes. For instance, in this example, race and sex, right? So we don't need to know exactly how these things actually work. All we need to know is that what exerts causal influence on what in order to determine counterfactual fairness. Hopefully that all makes sense now. And we'll apply that a couple times to see how it shakes out if that's not clear at this point. Okay, so now I just want to work through 2 more examples really briefly, showing that even though maybe like egalitarianism and counterfactual fairness sort of are in the same ballpark, And again, like I said, the people who first developed counterfactual fairness say that they were motivated by luck egalitarianism. I want to show now that these things come apart. And if anything, this should help deepen our understanding of counterfactual fairness to the extent that it's not clear at this moment. Okay, so the first question I want to ask is, if your system is counterfactually fair, is it automatically okay by the lights of luck egalitarianism? And I want to show first that it's not. So passing the counterfactual fairness test is not enough for satisfying luck egalitarians. Here's a case that helps us see this. And the case is called Law School Success 2. In Law School Success 2, seeing that race affects grades and LSAT scores and valuing counterfactual fairness, the admissions team seeks to base entry on a different variable. So they scratch the initial system that I just described because it's counterfactually unfair. As it turns out, applicants come from two perfectly integrated high schools to which students were randomly assigned. One high school happens to have high quality pre-law courses, whereas the other has no pre-law courses whatsoever. The admissions team uses the pre-law course as a determining factor in their admissions decisions, reasoning that anyone who passed the pre-law course would excel in the law school. Now, this is like a overly fussy kind of detailed example, but the basic idea is that the law school now says, hey, look, there's this variable, how someone performed in this pre-law course, that is not causally downstream of any protected attributes. And it seems to be like a good metric by which to judge people's maybe future success in law school. We could base admissions off of that. Such a system would be counterfactually fair just by hypothesis, right? Because there's no causal influence on the pre-law courses from things like race and sex. And yet the luck egalitarian would say, I'm not satisfied with this as a luck egalitarian. And to see why, we could just think about the people who would have liked to go to law school, but were randomly assigned to the high school that doesn't have pre-law courses. They would say, hey, I never had like an opportunity. I'm made worse off through no choice of my own. This random assignment took away an opportunity from me. So even though the Law School Success 2 system is counterfactually fair, it's not fair by the lights of luck egalitarianism. Okay. Maybe these are getting tiresome, so here's our last case. The last thing that I want to ask is whether satisfying counterfactual fairness is at least required for satisfying luck egalitarianism. And this last case will show that it's not even a requirement for satisfying luck egalitarians that you have a counterfactually fair system. And the case that I want to use to demonstrate this is one called Internship. So in Internship, you're hiring for an internship that requires English-Spanish fluency. All students had to take a language class, but only some took Spanish, even though all had the opportunity. Among the cohort, there are many Hispanic students who speak Spanish at home and thus are fluent whether or not they took the class. Again, that's a kind of oversimplification just for the case. You have applicants take a Spanish exam as part of their application. Now, to make things just totally clear, here's the causal model for your Spanish score. And we're basing entry on your Spanish exam score. The fact that we have a variable, ethnicity, exerting influence on the thing that we want to use to base our prediction off of shows that the system is not counterfactually fair. And yet, the luck egalitarian doesn't have to see a problem with this. They'll say, look, people had a choice as to whether or not to take the Spanish class. And in this case, we can imagine that they all had to take a class. They could have chosen Spanish or French or German or whatever. And there was no like illegitimate barriers to taking those classes. And so even though some people will achieve Spanish fluency throughout by not taking the class, making the system counterfactually unfair, the luck egalitarian needn't see a problem with the system. And so that just goes to show that counterfactual fairness isn't even a requirement for being a luck egalitarian or for satisfying a luck egalitarian. Okay, so that was like just a little bit of an exploration of some of the space of fairness measures. And I think that hopefully one thing that's, if I could say so, nice about the talk is that we've at least looked at not just two fairness measures, but two really different kinds of fairness measure. One that just looks at a kind of statistical analysis, keep these kind of outcomes in proportion. And we've looked at a totally different kind of fairness measure that uses like causal modeling and goes beyond statistics. And then we've also looked at a variety of different ways of understanding what egalitarianism might ask for in different contexts, and seen that there's just kind of like a different menu of options out there that don't perfectly align with each other. So a couple lessons I wanted to draw from this. One is kind of a conjecture. And the conjecture is that certain fairness measures might be perfectly good means for pursuing certain egalitarian ends in certain contexts, but it's doubtful that there's going to be a sort of all-purpose measure. And I kind of mean two things by that. One is that I'm skeptical that there's going to be just some fairness measure out there that's going to kind of always work to show that you're kind of being egalitarian fair, either as something that's enough of, like, it's satisfying the measure is going to be enough to show this, or that it's going to be a requirement. I'm also skeptical that, at least of the measures that are out there, that you can even select a measure automatically on the basis of just kind of knowing what egalitarian kind of goal you have in mind. And hopefully, like, the cases I've shown kind of show that there's always going to be some wiggle room and some room for thinking. What that means is that choosing a proper measure for a situation is just going to require great nuance and sensitivity to normative and empirical considerations. This is just kind of another way of saying, when you want to tell whether a system is fair, if you're auditing it or building it, there's not going to just be sort of an off-the-shelf measure that you can use. You're going to have to think about quite a few things and be careful about how you do this. And that kind of brings us back to that flow chart I have at the beginning, that framework, as I called it. And then lastly, this takes me beyond some of the things I talked about, but it is something that, at least for me, as someone who's been thinking about this stuff and then worked through these ideas, that popped out to me as something that was, like, kind of interesting. And so this takes us a little bit beyond what I've said so far. I'll read it first and then explain what I mean. So the thing that I think is, like, kind of interesting that popped out to me as I was thinking through this was that the appropriateness of an accuracy-fairness trade-off doesn't necessarily have to look at the size of the loss of accuracy or fairness. Let me explain what I mean by that. Sometimes you might imagine that you can take a system or body of data and because it's failing by the lights of a fairness measure, treat the fairness measure as a constraint, rebuild the system, and have a new system. And in so doing, you might move towards the fairness ideal of that measure, but lose accuracy, right? The easiest example of this is that one of the most basic measures, even if you can even call it that, is just a prohibition on using protected attributes at all as inputs. But the thing is that if you ignore attributes, if you ignore those attributes, you are going to be less accurate in a lot of cases, right? So you maybe achieve a certain kind of fairness, but you also become less accurate in so doing. And much of the time that I've seen people discuss this issue, you kind of just get the sense that people are looking at relative sizes, like how much fairness are we achieving, how much accuracy are we losing? And that's a relevant consideration. But another thing that is deeply important that kind of analysis misses is, in virtue of what are you losing accuracy or gaining fairness, right? And now if you'll kind of imagine with me, if we're, say, trying to be counterfactually fair, and so what we do is we move away from something like the Spanish exam, which was determined counterfactually unfair, and move towards something like the pre-law course, whether someone took a pre-law course and passed. We might be achieving counterfactual fairness, but we might be not doing something good if, for instance, like egalitarianism is the right thing to be doing in that context, because we're moving towards a set of variables or towards a system that's going to make people worse off through choices that were not there, for reasons that were not of their own choosing, right? So one thing that this kind of helps me to see is that we want to move beyond just looking at the size of kind of accuracy fairness trade-offs, even though the accuracy, we don't want to lose accuracy, generally speaking. But we also want to kind of know, in virtue of what are we losing or gaining accuracy, or losing or gaining fairness, at least in relation to some measure. Like, we might be becoming more counterfactually unfair, but we might just be less fair as a result, because, for instance, like egalitarianism is true, and we're in one of those cases where like egalitarianism and counterfactual fairness come apart. Okay, so that was the last little kind of lesson I wanted to draw from the discussion, but hopefully we got more of that than just these 3 bullet points. Here are some of the sources I leaned on explicitly, but of course there are many, many other things that influenced me here. If people want like a draft of the paper, I'd be happy to share it. It'll have a fuller list of sources. Thank you very much for your time. It was fun. Hope you enjoyed it.
mic.
Sure.
So Dr. Castro is going to take questions, and if there are people online want to send in questions, you can either use the chat or the Q&A.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I guess I'll field the ones in the room and you'll do, okay, good, yeah. Good, yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good question. I think the answer is really complicated. So I don't think that necessarily accuracy and fairness are in tension with each other. It's just that they can be. And also I think that what you mean by accuracy, what we mean by fairness could also just be kind of complicated, because obviously you can think like fairness, fair in relation to this measure or that measure or some other measure, fair in relation to this egalitarian standard, this other egalitarian standard, or fair in relation to, I don't care about egalitarianism, I have some other kind of understanding of what's fair, right? But and I think that most of the accuracy fairness trade-offs is that you can be forced, your hand could be forced that in pursuing fairness, you're forced to be less accurate. So let's imagine, I mean, I think that maybe like, this is like the actual context where this comes up. Let's imagine that at least on most people's interpretation of the law, you should really just totally ignore things like race, gender, sex, and all this stuff, right? Because you might be accused of discrimination, right? Now, there's what the law demands in that area. I'm no legal scholar, but what the law demands in that area can at least be kind of questioned. But at least on most people's interpretation in a lot of contexts, things like compass should just not look at it. It's just better off for not looking at it. However, it might be that you could be way more accurate and maybe even truly in relation to ethics or like political philosophy or whatever, you might actually be more accurate and more fair if you paid attention to that stuff. But because of what the law requires, you ignore it. And so like, because you're kind of treating what the law asks for as a constraint, you use a certain kind of fairness measure that builds that in. And so like in some way you're pursuing fairness and becoming less accurate. But like I just said, I just gave a really complicated response, but that's maybe because that's like how things actually are. And I was a little bit kind of qualifying this stuff with the law because at least I'm familiar with some folks like Deborah Hellman has a paper where she's not only looking at the kind of stuff I'm looking at, but she's also looking at legal stuff and legal interpretation and questioning whether the kind of default assumptions the assumptions people make about the law that then inform how they want to measure accuracy, whether that's like, you know, there's a whole bunch of nest of legal questions there just to complicate matters. But yeah, I mean, let me put it this way. Assuming some things, like let's just assume that we do want to be counterfactually fair and we want to be like egalitarians. To the extent that we can get more accurate, that just might make us fairer and fairer and fairer and fairer, right? And so it might be the case that like in the limit where we're being perfectly accurate, we're also being perfectly fair. So they're not necessarily in opposition, but there's just a very complicated, I think, nest of things. And a lot of it kind of boils down to one of the lessons of the talk is just, what do we mean by fairness? Are we talking about measures? Are we talking about egalitarian principles? Are we talking about something else? Stuff like that. Yeah. And then there's like the whole complicated business in the background of like, well, what are our legal obligations? And what if the law is requiring us to be unfair? And how do we build that in? How should we be sensitive to that? So yeah, hopefully answered the question. Yeah, so I mean, I have to think through that a little bit because I'm not quite sure that much of what I've said so far tells us whether or not to be holistic or not. I mean, like I said earlier with your other question, um, I'm kind of focusing in on just a couple issues, and we've bracketed some other things, which are all like themselves really complicated. So, I mean, you might think, I guess what I was going to say initially was there's this idea in some areas, I mean, in a lot of areas of ethics, that ought implies can. And that means that like what you're morally required to do is sensitive to what you can do. And I have a sense that when it comes to this sort of stuff, when you're building an actual admissions system, part of that question of how holistic to be is going to be sensitive to how holistic can you be, right? Um, and 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 I'm not sure I could say something too determinate here, but I kind of want to gesture at it as in the following way. It might be the case that like when you want to look at people holistically, one of the things you want to be able to look at, something you want to look at are like attributes of people that are like pretty unique to them, maybe. And being sensitive to those sorts of things might be in tension with a lot of ways that we do machine learning, right? Because what I can do is use reams and reams and reams and reams of SAT scores to detect patterns about students generally speaking, right? But if I also want to consider people's really unique life experiences, right? There isn't going to be like a really great way, I think, generally speaking, at least, like to use like a machine learning approach to incorporating those unique facts about people's interesting, like really unique narratives into decisions about them. And how exactly to balance that is an interesting and difficult question, right? And so like, I think that like to the extent that we want to be fair and the extent that maybe we think that fairness demands like us being holistic in a certain kind of way, there's this further question of, well, there's the first question about like exactly how that could be demanded by the kind of ideas we're considering here. But then there's like this other thing about like, how are we even to incorporate that? Should we have a machine that's just kind of like looking at GPAs and SATs, spitting out one number about like, look, this person will probably succeed. And then we kind of look at someone's narrative and make a human intuition about like, and this person also deserves like a couple extra points. Is there a way of integrating like a system that can read this kind of stuff? I don't think so right now, at least, or at least like not at the scale that most schools are going to be able to do this with very much confidence, right? And that just gets kind of into a complication as to how exactly to incorporate any kind of predictions into our decisions, right? So like Compass looks at the kinds of stuff that I have lots of information about, looks at people's like arrest history and all sorts of other things about them, has them take a little like personality test and these sorts of things, right? But then if that person shows up and says a certain sort of thing or gives a kind of a compelling kind of account of what's happened to them or something that's just recently changed in their life that isn't the sort of thing that Compass considers as a variable, you kind of back to the same question. Do I just rely on the machine? Do I try to combine these two in some kind of intuitive way? Because I don't know if we can make a machine that's going to be able to like incorporate these bespoke variables, right, in a way that's really going to be respectable. It's going to be kind of random or kind of like whatever. So, I mean, I think that like maybe, and this is something that like maybe sometimes the philosophers have to do is say, I can give you show you some distinctions, how to weigh certain things, how to think about them, some complications to be aware of. But some of these questions I think are just really hard. And yeah, I'm not sure, like, for instance, on the question of holistic evaluation, how exactly to translate that into the terms of the things I was talking about here. Yeah, but they're in the really important kinds of considerations that I think we would have to consider. Oh, ask if there's any questions. Yeah, if people have any other questions, I guess this is for the people online. Yeah, just put them in the chat. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that is that the question? No, that's really so there's a lot there. So the case was that you can imagine the case as being like this far off possible world where I'm just trying to illustrate a point where we're just assuming like a kind of more ideal society or something like this. But I agree with everything you have to say there. So like, first of all, what's that? Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. And I probably should repeat the other questions as well. So that I think, let me see if I can kind of backpedal here. I should have done this anyways because it's like good practices. Yeah. So the question was in the example that I gave where people were randomly assigned high schools and whether they took the law class was fed into whether they get into the law school basically. The question was even in that case where I made my stipulations, isn't there tons of room for racism and sexism, for instance, within the classroom, which is where a lot of this happens anyways. So and then I think as a follow-up, or at least what I wanted to also talk to you is the follow-up was like, first of all, so doesn't that case not really work? Isn't it not so clean? And secondly, isn't everything going to be, isn't everything considerable going to be affected by race or sex and other attribute and other things in some respect, such that nothing's going to be counterfactually fair? And I think that those are both really interesting questions and ones that I actually started off extremely concerned about. And actually part of why I wanted to look at counterfactual fairness more closely when I started thinking about this project were some similar sorts of concerns actually. So in relation to the first question, what I wanted to say was, well, let's just suppose for the purposes of the example that we can kind of like idealize and idealize and idealize. And we come up with a version of the case where the teachers are great and the high schools are great and the whole society is great in ways that nothing is affected by race and gender in this example, race, gender, sex, whatever you want to treat as like the kind of important attribute to be aware of. So all I want to do in that case is say like, okay, let me just keep gesturing towards a case where we can kind of see how these things would come apart. But then I think that as what I just said evidences, if I have to do that much idealizing, isn't it the case that it's going to be really hard to predict these sorts of things in a counterfactually fair manner? And I think, yes, that's true. That's a kind of important thing to think about. like on one thing that I worry about with counterfactual fairness, because actually, let me go back to a slide real quickly, if I can. Never mind. In my causal model, one thing, so that example, and I think it's still this way in the paper, ends up being itself kind of a problem for counterfactual fairness, because think about studiousness. Nobody asked what does studiousness mean, right? So one thing could be, quote unquote, let's say call it developed studiousness. Like studiousness habits developed over a lifetime. Well, how studious an individual ends up being, will be sensitive, for instance, to facts about like their housing situation and the amount of food they have at home and whether or not they have to work a second job and these sorts of things, right? So if it's related, if that's what studiousness amounts to, then even studious not having an arrow into studiousness doesn't make sense, right? And so one worry you might have is, suppose we just, monomaniacally focus on being counterfactually fair, we might be driven towards systems that are just like basically lotteries, right? In a way that we might think is actually not good, because the lottery system might be fair in some sense, but now we're just like not even considering people's qualifications anymore, because we have to reach so far to find something that has any predictive value that isn't affected by a problematic feature. And I do think that that's just a problem. I mean, there's a kind of question about like, what does that say? What does that mean? But one thing that it does mean is that maybe if we treat counterfactual fairness as a constraint now, we'll end up with systems that are fair and unfair in some way. And we'll want to explain that. I mean, perhaps the way, I mean, there'd be a question about how to apply like egalitarianism to that. One thing that I skipped over, or one thing that I used was formal equality of opportunity. And that one says that you should be sensitive to merits in some way or another, right? And so like that standard might kick in and say like, at some point, actually the lottery system is also really bad. But yeah, I mean, I don't really have much of a reaction other than that. I totally agree. And actually, this is a problem for counterfactual fairness, at least if we treat it as a constraint, because we might be driven from one kind of unfair thing to just something that's unfair in some other kind of way. In which case, we might want to say like, okay, what's driving all of this? Now let's start thinking really hard about what fairness demands in like a kind of principled, kind of philosophical way. And then maybe use what we could figure out there to determine some other way to measure fairness. Because if you just go for something like counterfactual fairness, I worry that you'll be driven to like a kind of lottery system that's not fair, actually. Yeah. Yeah. I think there might be a question. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yep. Yep. Yeah. So yeah. 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 So I think there's like kind of three comments. I have to repeat, I think, for the people online anyways. And it's good practice anyways. I should have been doing it all along. So the first thing was I might have raised more questions than I answered. This is the not, I mean, I want to just kind of say that's what philosophers do because it's not necessarily what we do. But I mean, this is that kind of talk. It's almost kind of one of these things where I want to say, I mean, the way that I think about the talk is it might be helpful for people who are in data science to be exposed to something like this. Like, oh, like fairness isn't just one monolithic thing. Egalitarianism is one. You got to kind of think about all the different options here, and it's complicated, right? Um, uh, and, and also like the idea is also the other side of this is like for philosophers they might be able to see like what this kind of fairness measuring business looks like. And then hopefully just people need to be talking more and thinking more about this stuff. But yeah, this is not the kind of talk that's like chock full of answers, but hopefully gives people lots of stuff to think about. Yeah. Yeah, definitely, definitely. And so I hope I gave people this fun stuff to think about, because I do think that these things are just kind of like, for me at least, it kind of ticks like a certain kind of box of like a fun, like a puzzle to kind of work through. Now, there was two further kind of comments. One is about, well, fairness, accuracy. One way in which they can't be siloed is like, to the extent that maybe I have limited spots, and the extent to which I'm inaccurate, I'm sort of forsaking a spot for somebody who could have made better use of the slot. I agree with all of that. And I think that anybody who's like kind of worked through the real details of like really trying to think about fairness from any philosophical point of view knows that this stuff is just super, super complicated. And like, I think that that's just another parameter that I maybe didn't pay close attention to in this talk to kind of isolate some issues, but that's like another thing to think about. And to the extent that it is something to think about, I think it actually does a good job of highlighting how there's two different notions of fairness being used when you point out that problem, right? Because I typically what I take is that when people talk about accuracy, fairness, trade-offs, they have a kind of common sense understanding of accuracy, or maybe some kind of accuracy measure. Then they have some kind of fairness measure that they want to achieve or get closer to achieving, right? And that fairness measure, like the ones that I talked about, none of those are sensitive to inefficiency of a certain kind, right? Like inefficient allotment or something like this, right? Or and insofar as you want to account for that, to me, like given the way that I'm talking about this, you might not want the fairness measure to do everything and always have it automatically built in, but you just kind of might have be sent. That might be like one of the kind of more nuanced empirical or normative considerations you have in mind when you're selecting for a measure. Like, is this measure going to be insensitive to efficiency in a way that is to the system's detriment or not, or something like this, right? Because at some point, it's like I almost want to say that like we can use these measures in ways that don't at all match what they look like on the surface, but it still might be the right measure for a situation given its nuances and quirks, right? And then finally, this idea of one thing we should be sensitive to is people's exposure to sexism and racism and other sorts of things. I think that's correct. And one way we might try to build that in is just by using the kind of coarse measures I've talked about and just being really careful about how we select and use them. But another thing, and I'm not sure how much I can say about this, is one thing is we might also want to start to use measures that don't just look at ratios of outcomes or kind of like the causal influence of certain kinds of variables, but maybe you look at you try to start with some kind of understanding of people's levels of well-being or exposures to sexism and racism, and you start to build in some kind of like utility function that kind of approximate the people you're working with in some kind of way to understand that as an important dimension of fairness that you want to account for. The other thing, and this kind of gets into something I'm thinking of just starting to think about now, is that, and I'm not quite sure how to put this precisely, like, because I'm still working on it. Maybe one way to work towards this is one of the things that I think made counterfactual fairness kind of malfunction as a proxy for like egalitarianism is it just kind of assumed that sort of like the kinds of things that the law treats as protected attributes are just the things to use and equalize across, right? But maybe we need to look at things in a much more sophisticated manner than that. Like, for instance, just which attributes are chosen or unchosen. And even that's not the best thing, because we might think that certain unchosen attributes are fine to make decisions based off of, but other ones are definitely not fine. And it has to do with like a history of racism or sexism or discrimination or something like this, right? And so actually, which categories we treat as protected attributes or how we group people, we might want to rethink that in a certain kind of way. And one thing that I thought about just a little bit, I'm like just on the edge of thinking about this, is that none of these measures seem to have anything obvious to say about how different protected attributes might interact with each other. So like none of them really give us an automatic way of understanding why a bias in one direction or not the other might be more problematic. So like kind of the jobs case and the compass case showed that a little bit, but also like how we might not want to just think about equalizing across black and white here and man and woman over here, but thinking more about all of the different ways those things kind of work with each other and how that might give us different things to kind of look at, if that makes sense at all. Like, so again, all I can say is that like I think, yeah, there's a lot more to be thought about here. And one thing to think about are things like people's relative levels of well-being as a thing that might matter. And that's not necessarily a protected attribute, right? It's just, but that's an important thing to consider. And also things having to do with like intersectionality and how it's not just we want things to be equal across these categories, but we want to think about how those categories mix and combine and the different histories of the different traits and how people have been treated on the basis of those traits. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.